In this chapter, we start to know, after our understanding in the first half of this class of understanding elasticities and understanding the optimal consumption bundle and the optimal production mix of inputs, now we start to look at different ways in which firms are organized. This topic of industrial organization, just in general, became a large topic in the 1920s when there was this kind of existential question, about as existential or philosophical as economists become, about what is a company, what does it do? And the dominant belief among, um, let's just call them orthodox economists, meaning your kind of standard run of the mill economist, is that the reason why companies exist is because transaction costs in production are lower, meaning it's cheaper to bring everyone together in the same building and use the same equipment than to piecemeal it out and have people doing things at their own home and then bringing those things, to a central location. So companies exist to lower um, transaction costs, and the idea would be is that those companies, once they exist to produce something, can have several different forms. Those four forms that you learned about in your principles class would be perfect competition on one extreme and monopolies on the other extreme, with monopolistic competition and oligopolies in the middle of that um, in the middle of middle of those extremes. Now, at that time, the 1920s, remember that the United States was just getting over the President Theodore Roosevelt kind of agenda of breaking up monopolies. And the government at the time took on a more proactive stance to regulating monopolies and breaking up monopolies, because the idea is that under monopolies that prices are higher for consumers, the product might be of lower quality, and that there's less production of the item. So and so at that time in the early 1900s, the first 2 decades of the 20th century, you see a great deal of um, antitrust legislation. So with all of that now kind of in context for you, let's start to talk about what competitive firms are. So in this chapter, we've got competitive firms and markets. So essentially what we'll do is we're going to follow the same steps for each of these chapters as we look at each of these types of industrial structure. And so we start here with perfect competition, and we're going to have to find what is the rule by which profit maximization occurs, right? Because that is essentially the goal of all companies. All companies want to maximize their profit. So how do they determine how much to produce to determine their maximized profit? And then we'll look at how the structure of the perfectly competitive firm, how that structure changes in the short run versus the long run. Okay, so first, some kind of definitions here of what we're talking about. When we're talking about market structure, we're talking about characteristics. Those characteristics being, let's go here to draw. How many firms exist? How easy is it to enter and exit the industry? Now, that would mean, are there, for instance, legal challenges to entering or exiting, such as is the case with the airlines, right? You have to get a special license to transport passengers. Or it could be costs. How easy is it to enter that industry? Which would also be the airlines, right? You have to buy landing slots, you have to buy airplanes and whatnot. But that would also apply to something like the energy sector, right? If you're going to drill oil, it's going to be pretty expensive to drill for oil, or to start a pharmaceutical company, or even to start a university. How different is my product? How different can I make it from others? In other words, if I want to make a keyboard, I'm probably going to have the same layout of the keys. So then how am I going to differentiate my product, right? With the way that the keys click, for instance, or how much space it takes, how well it connects to my computer. Um, well, we'll just leave it here. It only lists these three, so let's just leave it at those three. There's others, but we'll keep our life easy here. And when we look at these characteristics, these three characteristics, for the perfectly competitive firm, of which we don't have very many real life examples, so let's keep that in mind here. For the perfectly competitive market, there are many firms. There are low barriers, or basically non-existent barriers to entry and exit. And the product is not differentiated. You can already see there, those are pretty extreme characteristics. Really, the only thing that even comes somewhat close to a perfectly competitive market structure would be something like agricultural products. But again, even growing agricultural products does require some significant costs, some barriers to entry and exit, such as buying seed, buying fertilizer, transporting it. But the idea there, like if I was growing pumpkins, there are many farmers out there that grow pumpkins. Pumpkins aren't really differentiated from each other, right? They're orange, they grow big. And it would become very difficult to differentiate your pumpkin from your competitive farmers, right? From your competitors' pumpkins, right? How would I know it's Farmer Jones versus Farmer Smith's pumpkins? It'd be pretty tough. These firms, these perfectly competitive firms, are price takers, meaning that the price that they charge, they have no influence over it whatsoever. They take the market price as their price. What it does, and you might remember this from your principles class, what it does is it creates a structure, big P, big P, big P, big Q, meaning the entire market price and quantity. So let's just pick a food commodity here of apples. The idea here is that there's a demand curve and a supply curve for apples in general, given to us in the entire market. And then there's me, Farmer Tom. Let's say that's $3 for, I don't know, a dozen apples. I'm sure that price is not reasonable. But now notice I'm going to have the same P here, but now I'm going to have a lowercase q. Lowercase q is going to stand for the firm output, whereas large Q is going to stand for the market output. And the idea here is that as long as I, Farmer Tom, am charging the $3 price, I can produce as much as I want as long as it is that $3 price. Thus, as you see right here, the demand curve is horizontal at that market price. So here, lowercase d stands for demand for just the firm's output. And well, this just repeats what I had said, but adding to it the other things that I wanted to add to it. But basically, what does it mean to be a perfectly competitive firm, and what are the consequences to that firm's demand curve being horizontal? Well, that would mean that there are many buyers and sellers. They are all producing the exact same thing. Now this is the part we didn't have in the initial set of conditions, but buyers and sellers have complete information, complete knowledge about what all the prices are. The transaction cost to buying from any individual firm is negligible to zero, and firms can freely enter and exit the market. So the idea here would be is, why would you buy gas from a gas station that you know to be higher? Why would you, and it's not just that it's more convenient to get it, right? If you've looked at the lines at Costco to get gas, they're really long. But then those are like those, what are they? They're like, it's like a Liberty gas station, I think, or something like that. Um, and the price is like really close to it. Not as low, but pretty low. But some people obviously then might say, I'll pay a little bit more and get it at Liberty rather than wait in that really long line at Costco, right? Or in the case of Costco, you have to be a member to get the gas. So it's not exactly a good description. Same with like most agricultural products, right? I don't know what the price is at all the grocery stores, and I'm not certainly not going to buy. It'd be pretty costly as a transaction cost to buy my apples at one place and my mushrooms at another because of a 2 cent difference between the two. So again, not entirely realistic. Um, these characteristics, but at least in theory, we have a good sense of what the differences are. And what that means for us, well, I guess I just kind of said this here, is that most markets are not perfectly competitive. So basically, it's not realistic what we're talking about in this chapter. But before you say, well, why should I care about this chapter? Why are we doing this? The reason why we're doing this is because we need this basis of understanding to understand the more realistic forms of competition that we encounter. And even if they're not perfectly competitive, the industries could be really, really competitive. So here we can think about the market for pencils, for instance, which is probably pretty competitive. Same with pens, is probably pretty competitive. Same for groceries, most food items is pretty competitive. Paper, pretty competitive. So some of these same conclusions are going to generally apply. And essentially, what it means for us here is that in these competitive markets, that the individual seller has no influence on the market. They can do whatever they want as long as they take the market price. That also means that they also don't engage in any um, strategies that differentiate their product from someone else's. So, as an example, my I have little kids, and obviously every Halloween they want to go pick a pumpkin, and so we go to this place um, in Waimanalo, and it's like probably some of you are aware of it. It's this pumpkin farm over in Waimanalo, and they engage in a lot of marketing, right, to differentiate their pumpkins from others, right? The old farmer guy takes you around, and it's almost like he's a preacher more than he is a farmer. But he's riding everyone around on his little tractor, preaching about the Lord and pumpkins and whatnot. And additionally, the pumpkins are higher priced than they are at Safeway, right? Which they come from California, I think, or Nevada, something like that. And obviously, the experience is different. So this guy, right, the preacher guy over in Waimanalo, knows that he's selling a non-differentiated product, but he's going to now invest in differentiating his product so that he can charge a premium. Just as other farmers would grow their pumpkins with organic methods or whatnot, all in an attempt to be able to charge a premium over the market price. But if they don't engage in any activities that differentiate their product from others, then all they can do is take the market price. Okay, so what we need to do here then is we need to derive each individual firm's demand curve. And what that would mean is that we are left with a residual. What that means is that whatever other firms, whatever a firm provides, supplies to the market, then the other firms have to make up that difference. And so you kind of see this here, that the residual demand curve is going to be equal to the difference between what I as a firm provide, what I as a firm provide as the supply side of it, taken out from the demand. So there's a residual after the demand is taken out from, supply is taken out from the demand. That residual would be the rest of the market demand curve. It probably makes a little bit more sense here to see it visually. And so what we see here is that with the side-by-side graph, what we see is that as we have a market price here, a market price of 66. That gives us the starting point for our individual demand curve. But now you notice here that there's a slight angle to that demand curve. Why is that? Because it's reflecting the residual. That what changes is that as the firm provides more and more, what that would presumably mean is that the total market as a whole has less and less. It's not much though. And as you can see here, it isn't much because this curve doesn't really have a very significant slope. So this is again going back more to the reality of how a perfectly competitive firm looks visually. And now to get back to our idea of the elasticity also makes a difference. So what would be the elasticity of demand for a perfectly competitive firm's product? Well, it would theoretically be infinitely elastic, right? The moment I try to charge something a little bit more, I capture none of the market. And the moment I try to charge a little bit less, I capture the entire market. So the elasticity of demand is pretty important here for the firm, but it's only important basically at the extremes. And essentially, what we'd see here is that n minus 1 for those number of other firms, the elasticity for any individual firm is going to be, essentially either 0 or infinite, depending on how that price differs from the market price. So let's look at an example of this. Let's try to do the examples this way as opposed to some of the homework questions. So here we've got 78 firms that are making metal chairs. The elasticity supply being 3.1 and the elasticity demand being negative 1.1. Okay, so let me write this down on a paper while we're doing this so I don't have to keep scrolling back here. So give me 1 second here. Okay, so all I did here is I'm just writing it down so we can work with this here. Okay, so essentially we use our equation here, right? Write the equation from, our equation from here, right? Where we take the elasticity is equal to our number of firms times the elasticity for the individual firm minus n minus 1 times the elasticity of supply. So, right, we see our 78 here. We had 78 firms, right? So we're essentially going off of, sorry, I didn't need to. Right, so we have this general equation here. We have 78 firms. We have an elasticity of demand equal to negative 1.1. And we have an elasticity of supply equal to 3.1. Essentially, we just inserted those here, right? We have the negative 1.1 here, 78 firms here. So 78 minus 1 is 77 times 3.1, which is our elasticity supply. I just changed the terminology here. That result tells us that for any individual firm, how much, how different is it from the market, right? And what we can see is that for an individual firm, E subscript I, that's negative 324, 300 times, right? Which, if we read this a different way here, which this should highlight for you the starkness of the challenge of being a perfectly competitive firm. That even if they just change their price oh so slightly, a tenth of a single percent, it loses a third of its sales. So incredibly elastic. I already said this, so I'm not, I'll repeat it again, but just to highlight again, why is it then that we're looking at this? Again, we can think of some examples that get pretty darn close to competitive. Again, agricultural products, commodity markets like oil. Stock exchanges is listed here because then, when we talk about the competition between NASDAQ and NASDAQ and Dow, there's not much of a difference. It's really just differences in terms of prices. And then retail and wholesale construction when we think about the production of things, construction of things. But we're going to use that then to understand other forms of competition. Now, let's turn then to that second goal here, which would be to understand how these firms decide how they're going to make money. Like, how do you make money in this kind of industry? Well, let's do a definition first, or a review first, of what does it mean for a firm to earn money. Well, that would just be profit would be equal to revenue minus costs, right? And if this difference is positive, then they have a positive profit. And if it's negative, then they're operating at a loss. What is revenue? Revenue is equal to the price times the quantity. Or if we're talking about individual firms, that would be a lowercase q. And the cost, well, we just looked at how costs are calculated. Well, not just, but we looked at that in the previous chapter. And we talked about the cost structure for firms, fixed costs and variable costs and whatnot. The only thing we are essentially not doing here in the costs necessarily are taking into account the opportunity costs, which are outlined here. The accounting costs are obviously a little bit more straightforward and easier to identify. So, what the firm needs to decide, and this is a pretty good slide. This is not every textbook does it this way, and this is one of the few textbooks that makes it this clear. A perfectly competitive firm basically has one of two, well, it has two decisions it has to make. It has to make both decisions. It has to decide how much is it going to produce, and then it has to decide about whether the firm should shut down or not. Now, the question of why would the firm shut down comes down to is the firm losing more money by continuing to operate than to shut down? So we're going to need to look at these two decisions. How did they decide how much to make? How did they decide whether to stay in business? So we have three decision points here. The firm is going to set its Q, its output, where its profit is maximized. It's going to set its output where its marginal profit is 0. And what that leads us to is this incredibly important rule. That firms produce where the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost. So this is, when you ask yourself, do I make one more or one less. That output decision is only determined by comparing the marginal revenue to the marginal cost. And what you need to do is equate the two to be able to determine how much you should be producing. So let's look at that. What is marginal revenue? Marginal revenue would be the change in total revenue over a change in quantity. So by selling one more unit, how much do I get? In the case of the perfectly competitive firm, marginal revenue is equal to the price, right? Because every time I sell one more, I get that price exactly back. And then what we would need to do is compare that marginal profit, which would be my marginal revenue minus my marginal cost, which essentially is my price minus my marginal cost. So my marginal profit will equal my price minus my marginal cost. And so we can see here that in general, if you're producing less than the optimal amount, you're essentially leaving some profit on the table. To have a positive profit here, that would mean that your marginal revenue is greater than your marginal cost. So essentially, you should produce more. But as you produce more, your price isn't changing, right? Because this is a perfectly competitive firm, the price is given. But essentially, as Q increases, the marginal cost increases, and it increases enough until MR equals MC. Over in this region here, sorry. Over in this region here, the marginal revenue is less than the marginal cost. Again, if price is constant, as Q increases, marginal costs still continue to increase. The problem here is that, again, the marginal cost vastly exceeds the marginal revenue. So here, as produce more, marginal profit is falling. They're not losing money, but they're not making as much money. Marginal profit falls till they get to this point here. At this point here, it starts to turn negative, which would mean that the profit now is actually being reduced, not the marginal profit, but the actual profit. So we've established firms produce things where marginal revenue equals marginal costs. And then what we need to do is think about when would a firm decide to shut down. A firm would decide to shut down when there are certain costs that it can't make back. So let's look at that. Okay, so the idea with shutting down is that you're trying to reduce your losses. So if you decide to shut down, you must be losing money. So the question really then becomes, are you making enough to cover some portion of your fixed costs? So, right? So the idea would be is that if you shut down, your variable cost would be zero because you wouldn't be making anything. And your fixed cost would be the loss. If you don't shut down, then your total costs, your profit must be less than your fixed cost, or I guess we could say here your negative profit, because it is your loss. Your loss would be less than your fixed costs. And you can kind of see this kind of example right here. So the idea is that I've got total revenue of $2,000 because I'm now actually producing something. If you shut down, obviously your revenue is equal to zero. So in this case, they decide to operate. They make $2,000. They make enough money to cover all of their variable costs of $1,000, and they cover $1,000 of their fixed costs. So their loss would only be $2,000. Whereas if they shut down, their loss would have been $3,000. And that's essentially what I'm highlighting for you here. Now, the firm in the short run can incur these losses. Right, in this case, that firm had shut by not shutting down, it was only losing $2,000. So this is the equivalent of saying to your landlord or to your, to someone else, hey, I'll catch you next month, right? I'll give you back all the money next month and more. But you can only do that so long, right? Um, eventually at some point, you have to come up with the money, and that in the long run, um, you can't have a negative profit. You can't have a loss in the long run. So when we look at these firms and we look at their output decision then in general, as I had said, we're going to set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. The marginal revenue is the same as its price, but this would imply that the marginal cost in the long run would also equal the price because MR equals MC. So we can replace one with each other and they would all equal the price. Graphically, it would look like this, right? So here, this firm is stuck. Let's see if we can make this a little bit bigger here. And let's get rid of, can I get rid of this? Yeah, I can. So the idea here is that the price is fixed. We're stuck with $8, right? Because there's a market here on the side where, well, okay, you get the idea here, right? Is that there's a market on the side here where the market price is $8. So that gave me my price equals my marginal revenue for my individual firm. Again, now we're going to look for the quantity where MR equals MC, where MR equals MC right here. Okay, so they're going to make 284 units. We also know that this would be the peak right here, where the marginal profit is equal to zero, where it's flat, essentially. Okay, so now the revenue is going to be this whole big rectangle here, or this essentially the square right here. But to make 284 units, there's an average cost of $650. So my quantity times my 650 is going to equal my total cost, which in this case would be 284, because that's my quantity, times 650 equals 1846. And my total revenue is equal to 8 times 284. Sorry, I should try to be consistent here. Okay, I can erase better than this shining. Come on. Okay, let's erase that all here. So that'd be 284 times 8. Which would equal 2272.
2272, which is my total revenue, minus my total costs, which are 1846, leaves me with 426. And since this is all in thousands, then that would be 426,000. You'll have to do something like that as we get closer to the next problem set. Okay. Now, what about taxes? Because these are firms that operate obviously in an environment where taxes can be charged. And so what if a per unit or specific tax was placed? Then how does that change how much is going to be produced? Well, we can look at it here. Essentially what that does is it raises the average cost. It raises the average cost by T, right? The amount of the tax. And essentially what it does is it reduces both the amount produced, and we can see that visually here, but it would also raise the cost, which reduces the profit. So, theoretically, we would see those two results for why taxes are a bad thing. Well, a bad thing if you're a company. Taxes aren't a bad thing in general, but taxes are a bad thing for a company because it does reduce the amount produced and it does reduce the levels of profit that a firm can make, at least in the short run. And essentially what that does for us here is that it's going to, going back to that shutdown decision, the firm is only going to shut down in the short run if producing is going to reduce its overall loss, right? And we saw that with the previous example with the 2000, that the firm reduced its total loss by still continuing to produce. But then the question would be what does the firm then need to be able to charge? Well, that would mean that the firm needs to be able to at least be able to charge its average variable cost. At this point, where price is equal to the average variable cost, the firm would theoretically be indifferent to producing or not. Because if the price was exactly equal to the variable costs, then the fixed cost would be the loss, right? And so if the firm decides to shut down, there could be startup costs or whatnot. So most likely a firm, if it was indifferent to shutting down or not, probably would choose to not shut down because of the various startup and shutdown um, expenses in reality that would be imposed. But the firm, if it's making less than the average variable cost, that firm will shut down because now the loss will be greater than the fixed costs. So let's write that out just so that everyone's clear here. Here we go. So when the price is less than the average variable cost, then the loss will be greater than the fixed costs. Okay, and so we can see that here, right? So we know already from our previous understanding here that average variable cost exists below the average cost, with the difference between the two being the average fixed costs. Kind of remember these shapes, I'm hoping. But essentially, when the price is exactly equal to its average variable cost, its average variable cost. So if we get down to here, $5, at $5, they're meeting none of the average fixed costs. So the average fixed cost times the quantity would be my total fixed cost. So here we can see that A is the shutdown point. When price is greater or equal to AVC, the firm will likely produce. And when the price is less than the average variable cost, the firm will shut down. Okay, so we can look at this here as actually this example is kind of I'm not sure what we'd actually learn from this example. I'm going to skip this example. I'm not sure we learn much, but let's just jump to yeah, let's just look at this picture here. What this means, I'm just going to jump to the conclusion here. What this means for us here is that the individual firms' supply curve is the marginal cost curve. And it starts where the price is greater than the average variable cost. So in essence, you could draw this as an open circle where the firm is indifferent to starting or not. The supply curve is completely vertical, meaning it produces nothing so long as the price is greater than 0. Then, as long as the price is 5, we then go vertical to that $5 point, and then we follow the marginal cost curve. Because, why is it the marginal cost curve? Because remember, all of the output decisions are determined by where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. All that we're doing here is changing the marginal revenue as the price changes. So it is a disjoint. Supply curve. Not disjoint, but it's not a constant elasticity and constant sloped supply curve. When we look at the reality of things, again, N is not going to be fixed because firms are going to enter and exit the market as they feel they need to, and that's going to all adjust based on what the profit levels are for the firms, as well as the loss levels. And what we could see is that if all these firms are identical, then in terms of the overall supply, that the overall supply would just then be the number of firms that there are times the amount of production for each individual firm. And what we would see, one of the conclusions that we reach is that as we get more and more firms, that the market supply curve is going to approach the minimum of the average variable cost curve. And as I said here, again, why we don't have constant elasticity is that the more firms that we have that are producing at any given price, then the more elastic the market supply curve is going to be, or basically flatter it's going to be. How does that look? Well, it looks like this, right? So we have a marginal cost curve, which is my supply curve starting at this $5 price. Right? And again, we could add into this here. You could add in this portion here. Once, a long time ago, I was a graduate student assistant. A long time ago, this must be like 20 years ago, 25 years ago. He insisted on this portion being also drawn. And he would take off points if the student didn't do it. Oh, I thought it was so annoying. I am not requiring you to do that. I'm just giving you a rhyme or reason as to why I'm doing that. So then the rest of the supply curve would be right here.
And essentially, what we're saying is that as we have more and more firms, that as you see here, that these supply curves are getting flatter and flatter or more elastic. As we covered, as each firm is producing a portion of the total market. And if we have two different firms with two different cost structures, what we would then see is that, so for instance, firm two has a different cost structure associated with it, such that its minimum price is 6. And then the first firm here has a different cost structure where its minimum price is 5. So then if we look at the entire market supply curve and we combine those two, it's going to be the first firm that's driving the supply in the beginning. And then, and only then, when we reach that $6 price, is firm two supply being integrated. So in essence, what we would have here is starting at 0 out to that $5 price. Then once we reach the $6 price, then adding in firm number 2. And what we can do when we look at, again, the comparison between the firm and the market is we can look at then as well the different points of the different points for the individual firm of how much they decide to produce. Firm 2, again, was able to produce as low as $5. Right? So they, at $5, this is where they enter the market. And so we see this demand curve 2 right here. So this would be that larger firm that had the lower costs. And then the first firm where the costs were higher, right? That firm doesn't really enter the market until later. And it's only when that firm enters the market that we see that demand curve there, which then again allows us to sort of add in the total market quantity as we add in each individual firm. So we see this difference between the two based on their internal costs. Now, what do we do about that tax that's being charged? Who's going to pay the tax? Because remember, economists don't necessarily care as much about what the legalistic tax burden is, meaning we don't care who actually has to make the payment to the government. What we care about is who has to, experience either higher prices or who has to experience lower costs in the end. So let's look at that. Let's look at the economic incidence of the tax. So as you can see here, that if we impose this tax, so for legalistic reasons, we can see that the taxes, that the legal incidence of the tax is on the seller. How do I know that? Because we shifted the supply curve when we added the tax. But what you see here is now a different post-equilibrium price. And essentially what we see here is a different sharing, an economic perspective, what the costs are for the firm. And so what we can visualize here, I'm not sure why they don't make it much clearer here for everyone, but essentially we would see that difference here in the market as a whole. And that's going to generate the level of cost sharing that we have between the producers and the consumers. Okay, let's make this a little bit smaller now so that we can see this. Now, let's make a transition from the short run to the long run. In the long run, the firm has to be able to
not lose money. So firms can, in the short run, make money and lose money. But as they lose money, then they would exit the market, right? If they lose enough money. Or if firms are making a profit, then new firms will enter the industry because they'll be like, hey, money to be made in growing pumpkins, so let's start growing it. And as that new firm enters the market and starts producing it, it would lower the market price. So we need to look at how do these firms in the long run maximize profit. Well, they follow the same rule. They're still going to set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. Marginal revenue still equals price. So price is still going to equal marginal cost in the long run. But, and this part's important, is that the profit will equal zero. Meaning the total revenue will equal the total costs in the long run. And essentially, we jump to the kind of the last bullet point here. Essentially, in the long run, firms would shut down if they can't meet all of their costs, because in the long run, presumably, all costs are variable. There is no such distinction between fixed costs and variable costs. So it has to be able to charge then at least its long run average cost rather than its variable cost. So in other words, price is going to equal average total cost. And we'll see that right here. Now, what we see here is individual firms having multiple scenarios in the short run of how they decide to produce, right? So we can imagine a firm deciding to have a very labor intensive structure, maybe a very capital intensive structure, and all of those imposing very different kinds of costs for the firm. And what happens is, so they, let's say they're kind of like niche producers that are producing things in a highly highly individualized way, so pretty expensive, then its short run average cost curve would probably look like this here. But what happens is that as they become bigger and they become more efficient in producing things, then the average cost will start to reduce. And it creates a sort of envelope where the short run average cost curve, so you can imagine here, I'm not sure why they didn't draw it more here, but essentially you would have all these various short run average cost curve possibilities. So we have different short run average cost possibilities based on different ways of producing. And so we can imagine a firm being inefficient in producing things and having a short run average cost curve far to the left, and then becoming better and having a short run average cost curve further to the right. But the portion of the average cost curve in the long run, where all of these short run average cost curves are possible, we can imagine that in the long run, they all envelop and create the long run average cost curve. So that's what we see right here, right? Is that essentially the long run market supply curve is basically the sum of all the supply curves of all the firms in both the short run and the long run. Because in the long run, firms can enter and exit the industry. So we now need to see how many firms are going to be there. And essentially what we would see here, and I'm not sure why they draw it this way where it makes a little bit less sense, but if firms are making money, meaning that the profit is positive, then in the short run, firms will enter and the price will fall. How do I know that? Because the industry as a whole would look like this. Right, so here's my individual firm. So here's my D equals MR. And we said it's making a profit, so we're going to put its average total cost here. Let's just say below it. Let's just throw in a marginal cost curve here. I'm making these numbers up a little bit here. So firms would enter that industry because they'd be like, hey, there's profit to be made, there's money to be made. So the supply curve would shift to the right. How do we know that? Because that's how the curve shifts when more firms enter. But notice what happens here. It drives the price down. Sorry, I don't know what it's doing there. Until they make no money. And the opposite would happen, just to kind of save time here. We would imagine that the opposite could happen as well. Rather than redraw this, I'll use the same graphs here. Right? Is that firms could exit if they were losing money. So what would that be? That would be that the average total cost curve was up here and firms lost money. So then they left the industry because they went bankrupt, thus driving the price up in the long run. So we can imagine that, again, all these changes can happen as firms can enter and exit the industry as they want to. And we can kind of see this here. They're going to walk you through this here, but you don't need me to do that. Essentially, the market supply curve then is it's going to be fixed. The market supply curve in the long run is going to be fixed at a certain price where their long run average costs exist. And that's what we see right here. That in the long run, the firm will have no choice but to charge the long run marginal cost, which is $10 in this case. Now, things change a little bit when you start to limit entry and exit into the market, because now what it does is it creates a little bit of pricing power. So let's look at what happens now. If you give some firm some pricing power, then what it's going to do is it's going to make their market supply curves be a bit upward sloping. Again, because they're going to have some pricing power. And this makes the discussion a little bit more realistic, but it also makes it a bit more complicated. I wouldn't worry yourself about it because I'm not going to ask you on the problem sets or on the exam any questions related to this. And you can kind of see this discussion here for cotton, for instance, where in certain countries there's a limitation imposed in the market and whatnot. But again, let's not concern ourselves with that. The other reason, though, that becomes a little bit more realistic and a little bit more applicable would be, these firms to produce something are having to get certain inputs to make things. And if their demand for the inputs becomes very large, then what we can imagine is that the firm would have to pay higher costs as these input costs rise. And we can kind of see that here, that as the firm produces more, then the marginal cost increases, which gives us a somewhat of an upward sloping supply curve rather than a horizontal supply curve. A fourth reason, why else could the supply curve be upward sloping? And that would be if the country itself is going to uh, demand a large portion of the supply. So we see that especially um, when we're talking about agricultural products, where to save farmers, right, to protect farmers, the government agrees to buy certain portions of the. Whoa, what is going on here? Oh, jeez. Okay, I just created 250 some slides here. That was pretty hardcore. Okay, well, I'm not gonna. Okay, let me pause this while I fix this problem. Okay, problem fixed. So again, in these cases, we can imagine that a country agrees to buy a certain amount, with then the residual left for consumers to buy, which would then again create a slightly upward sloping long run supply curve for perfectly competitive firms. Okay. So it's just going to solve a problem here, but we're going to deal with that on our own here. Yeah, we're going to deal with these parts on our own here when we get to the problem set. Okay, so that does it for our discussion of Chapter 8, Competitive Markets. Sorry, I interrupted the video there. So I'm probably going to end up repeating myself here for one moment. So again, this is the graphical, at least, representation of what it looks like to have the deadweight loss on the right-hand side. Now, typically, again, when you've looked at problems in principles class, we've talked about the deadweight loss that's generated by the reduction in the production levels. Here, what we're seeing is the reduction, at least in total economic welfare caused by overproduction. Doesn't happen as often, but again, usually the special cases are usually for a social purpose, such as providing too much agricultural product support or protecting other industries that a country might feel proud of, and thus we could have overproduction and even overconsumption of that product. Okay. But again, we've seen these before, and that's kind of what's described here. Is that typically it's government action? I'm not trying to be political here, where I say it's the government. Yeah, it's not that. But it's usually if we let the market theoretically operate as it wants to, we would be theoretically at efficiency and at equilibrium. When the government gets involved, it obviously doesn't necessarily know what the equilibrium level is, or isn't happy with what the equilibrium level is, and thus takes actions such as price controls or taxation to change the equilibrium price to something that's a non-equilibrium price. And as you change it to a non-equilibrium price, we then impact the welfare, meaning we impact the consumer surplus, the producer surplus, and create deadweight loss as well. The barriers to entry. Now, this is important. The barriers to entry become important when we're talking about the long run and the idea that only a normal amount of economic profit would exist in the long run. Because otherwise, what happens is a much higher profit level would be sustainable for a long period of time, or a loss would be manageable for a long period of time. Instead, as we see that entry and exit, the profit and loss levels get adjusted until we're at the point where we're at normal economic profit. Sometimes there are these barriers to entry are explicit restrictions, right? So the government, again, controlling who can be an airline. But other times what we're seeing here is that it's a cost that's a hindrance to starting something. And we can see those here, that there can be large sunk costs. These are large sunk costs where either the firm has to raise a lot of capital to start the new business, or the level of success is so uncertain that one doesn't want to even take the risk to make the investment. Then when we turn to sales taxes, is another way that the government can push things out of equilibrium. We can see that a new sales tax, obviously, we would remember from principles that the sales tax can cause the reduction in both consumer and producer surplus. That loss, most of it does get transferred to the government, but it's also the case that we create the deadweight loss. Let's just, we can look at this here, but let's just jump to this here and then I'll go back. So here we can see that we had remember there's a legal and an economic incidence of the tax. The legal incidence is usually binary. It's either all on the seller or all on the producer. And there's a few exceptions to that. For instance, our Social Security tax is split up between the two. But for the most part, legal incidence is most of the time going to be on the seller because it's easier to track. And here we can see that here, that we've got legal incidence all on the seller. So legal incidence means who's going to be responsible for actually turning over the amount of taxes to the government. The economic incidence is how is the consumer surplus and producer surplus affected. And here we can see that the tax is areas B plus D. Consumer surplus lost B. So now it's only A. Producer surplus lost D. Now it's only F. But again, the idea here is C and E represents the deadweight loss. Now let's go back to the slide that we skipped here, which essentially is what we see here, that the total welfare would be consumer surplus plus the producer surplus plus the tax. So in this case here, B and D. And going off of my memory, which isn't too good. So the idea here is that the total surplus would be A plus F plus B and D. But if we compare it to what it was before the tax, was A, B, C, D, E, F. After, it's equal to A plus B plus D plus F. Thus, we can see that the difference between the two is C and E, which is our deadweight loss. Okay. Now, you can tell I don't look ahead at the slides. I kind of just wing it. Well, dude, this is the clean way of it looking. Now, what is important about this is that you can calculate this, and which is what we will do on the problem sets, where you would calculate areas of triangles by 1/2 base times height, and you would calculate the area of rectangles by length times width, which would mean that you would need to calculate y-intercepts, for instance, for a supply curve and a demand curve. And then we can obviously solve something where we have a demand curve and a supply curve, and we need to calculate the deadweight loss. And we're given two scenarios, one where the demand curve is a bit more elastic than the other, and we basically have to look at what would be the tax consequences of that kind of event happening. And what we can see here is that when it is more elastic, what we can see is that the change is a lot different. And so here, sorry, I had to pause there, but so here what we see is that the more inelastic the demand curve, then the smaller the change in the smaller the change would be in the amount of tax revenue, right? So in this case, the reason why well, in this case, it's also a little bit different. So notice here the supply curve is completely elastic. And so with this completely elastic supply curve, what we're seeing is that by imposing the tax, the producer surplus increases by areas A, B, and C when we're with the elastic curve, and by A, B, C, D, E under the inelastic curve. But in both of these cases, also what we see though is that the quantity is reduced, either reduced to quantity 2 or quantity 3. And so what that does is it then changes, right? We've got this change now of the amount of tax that's coming in. With the tax imposed, we now would change, right? A, instead of now going to the producers, A goes to producers initially and then becomes the tax revenue. Areas B and C for the elastic curve, B, in this case, does end up going to producers, but C is still lost. And under the inelastic curve, B and D would go to the producer, but E and C would be lost. E and C being the deadweight loss. Now, what if we see this again, this tax? How do we see all these changes happening? Again, graphically, when we look at this, we can see the same sorts of things here. In this case now, we have a subsidy, right? So in this case, this subsidy is basically a negative tax, which now shifts the supply curve to the right instead of the left. But again, even the subsidy does create for us a deadweight loss. A deadweight loss of area E. And that's what we start to see here. Right? That if we start to, let's see here, A through G. Okay, so let's get this out here. So what would be the consumer surplus before? Consumer surplus before was A and B, which is what we see right here. Producer surplus would be the area above the supply curve to the price. That'd be areas D and G, which we see right here. Government revenue was 0 because there was nothing going on. So total welfare would be A, B, D, G, adding up consumer and producer surplus. Now with the subsidy, what you see is that D and E and D and G are going to producers and consumers. D, the subsidy, and E, D, and G. Because remember, the producer is going to be receiving that subsidy per unit sold. So ABDE, ABDG, what are they gaining, right? The difference, which would be D and E and B and C to their D and G. So if we go over here, B, the amount of the subsidy additional, and C. Now look at C. C didn't exist before. So now this is being captured by the producer because now they're selling 1.34 billion row stems instead of 1.25 times the 11 cents, which is our area C. But again, it does all ultimately result in deadweight loss because after the tax, which is basically being captured from consumers and producers to some extent, we still are left with F, our deadweight loss right here, which shows that even under a subsidy situation, we can still end up worse off. Instead of taxes, we can alternatively see this as a price support which is basically a price control. In this case, if we impose a price floor, which is what this would be, a price that's set artificially above the equilibrium. Now, essentially, what we see is the alteration of the consumer and producer surplus and the deadweight loss. Where is it all? A, B, and C before the floor, A after, A, B, and C before the price floor, just A after, so B and C are lost by the consumer. And then for the producer, it was E and F. Now it's just E. Right? A, B, C, E. Now, what we're seeing here, though, E and F. But then what we're seeing here is that E space still exists, but, right, the E space still exists. B was transferred from consumers to producers. But now we've got a little bit of a problem. We've got C, D, and F. So what do we do with these spaces, right? These spaces, now what we see is that C was lost by consumers and is now transferred to producers. F was lost by consumers, transferred to producers. What about D? So now if we look at this here, D is actually going to go to the consumer because now we are going to see more being produced, right? So now we've got this change here because at this price, this much is demanded, but this much is supplied. So the area above the supply curve to the price would be this entire region, B, C, D, E, and F. B and C were transferred from the consumer. D didn't exist before. So D's got to come from somewhere. Because what we've got going on now is a surplus, right? We've got more being supplied than demanded. Someone's going to have to buy that. Which is going to have to be the government. The government's going to have to step in and buy that difference. And that's what we see here. Just skipping ahead here, just in a little bit of a cleaner space, what we end up with is that deadweight loss. The deadweight loss now exists on the right-hand side here with this price support. And we saw that over here, right? Our deadweight loss was basically captured by the government. The government basically subsidized it. Here, the deadweight loss is a bit more problematic because no one is buying up that difference. Instead of through a price floor, we can see it all through a price ceiling. That would be a price that's set artificially below the equilibrium price, such as over here, where again, if we do the comparison of consumer and producer surplus, we can see it right here. I'm not going to go through the detail. I'm assuming we're all good with that. Okay. We got free trade restrictions. I'm going to not worry about that because we're not going to be covering that tariffs and quotas. You're certainly not going to see it on the exam. The final thing I just want to attach to here is this discussion of rent seeking. And this would be, we see this quite often in competitive markets where individuals spend a great deal of money in order to gain a particular advantage. And that behavior called rent seeking is also inefficient. Okay.